Max Gorlin, Melbourne Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
This is Nat Fyfe from the Fremantle Footy Club.
Trent Cotchin from the Richmond Footy Club.
Scott Pendlebury from the Collingwood Football Club. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Patrick Cooch from the Carlton Footy Club.
It's Rory Sloane here from the Adelaide Crows.
This is Tom Mitchell. You're listening to the Coaches Panel.
Hey friends, you got MJ from the Coaches Panel. I hope you're well and welcome back to another episode of the 50 Most Relevant, where we're counting down who I think are the most relevant players to look at across your SuperCoach, DreamTeam and AFL fantasy sides. Number 34, Caleb Serong. We told you yesterday we were going to talk about another docker. He's in, Caleb Serong. And every time we get a docker, we've got to talk to MiniMonk. Well, that's what it's looking like so far in 2023. Hello, MiniMonk. How are you, man?
Yeah, I'm good to be back-to-back episodes, and this certainly isn't the docker that I was expecting to be talking about at this point in the 50 most relevant, but I'm here to have a conversation about Caleb Serong, and I think that there's a lot of interest here that's, potentially slipping to the wayside from people just ignoring the price point or going for others at the price point.
Yeah, and you're right. That's what one of the mantras of the Coaches Panel is it's not about saying you must do this or you cannot do that. It's about a conversation. And is Caleb Serong in the conversation, or should he be in the conversation? The fact that I've got him in at number 34 is telling you I think he needs to be. Just the 21 years of age, soon to be 22 once the season gets underway. Last year, the highs were pretty high and the lows were painfully low. His top score last year in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam was against the Gold Coast Suns. It was a 126, while in SuperCoach, it was a 128 against the Collingwood Football Club. His career high scores both happened in the 2021 season. He was in the derby against the West Coast, or the Derby, depends on which part of Australia you're in, 135 in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, while it was a 143 against the Kangaroos in SuperCoach. In AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, he's coming off an average of 87.7. It means in those formats, he's going to set you back just a touch under 800K in DT and 777,000 in fantasy. 777, the number of perfection, right? Anyway, shut up, MJ. 90.6 in SuperCoach is his SuperCoach price point, meaning he is just $1,200 shy of being $500,000. And really, MiniMonk, Caleb Serong burst onto the scene for us in that 2020 season, didn't he? Became one of the best cash cows of the year. He ended the year with a massive ton and scored multiple tons across the year. And he highlighted from those early days that junior scoring pedigree that he had was going to translate at some point across to the elite level.
Yeah, I mean, as a Freo fan, I was waiting for him to make his debut in that 2020 season. I was like, come on, give him a crack. He can kill it. He'll be a gun. And then he comes out and he gets a couple of poorer scores, but then he shows and gets more consistency and gets some really good scores and ends up, finishing the season off with, as you said, that ton in both AF and SuperCoach, and then backs it up with another great season in 2021. And then, comes into 2022 and everyone's, a bit more hot on him. They're thinking, can he have that third year breakout? Can he go 100 plus in AFL Fantasy and 105, 110 in SuperCoach? But he comes into the season under. He comes in a little injured, doesn't have a great start to the season, has a few poorer scores, and everyone goes, oh, this guy, he's burnt me. Rough start. Everyone goes off of him. But then he just quietly churns away, has a good season, comes out, as you said, with an 87 average and 88 average in AFL Fantasy and a 90 average in SuperCoach. In your third year, you go, it's pretty good for a third-year player. You take those most times. Probably not what most people were expecting for him, especially the ones that started him. But, he's a pretty good player, and he provides a lot for fantasy coaches and for the Dockers in terms of their midfield.
Yeah, well, he ranked last year in the league, remembering he missed a couple of games battling that knee injury that hampered not just his preseason, but certainly that first month of the year, missed a couple of games with it. But he still ranked inside the league, top 20 by averages for stoppage clearances, contested possessions, handballs, and clearances. When we dive into some of the fantasy numbers of what he gave us last year, we've already talked about those seasonal averages, but in AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, an 87.7 consisted of 7 tons, just the one score over 120. Interestingly, 7 scores under 80. So that's some of the burn that MiniMonk is highlighting. But if you look at his season, almost in a bunch of splits, there's some interesting trends there. In AFL Fantasy and DreamTeam, it was a 77 for the first 5 games. He went at 88 in the last 5 games. In the middle 10 games, he went at 92.8. But there was a 6-game stretch between round 8 and 13. He hit the 102.5. That's premium territories in that 6 games. Over in SuperCoach, with that average of 90.6, he managed to give us a bunch of tons in that format too. 8 tons, just the 1 over 120. And also the same in DT and fantasy, the 7 scores under 80, using those same 4 splits across the year. First 5 games, 75.6. Last 5 games, 92.8. The middle 10 games, a 97. But the peak of his year was a 6-game stretch around 8 to 13, the same as AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. He goes at 109.3. That, I think, MiniMonk, are the signs that fantasy coaches are looking for with him, where they go, we see pockets and moments at the end of 2021 where he goes 118, 117, 116 in AFL fantasy, and 115, 135, 103 in his final 3 games of SuperCoach. It's that combined with this pocket of middle stretch where he seemed to be at his best, contested footy, getting it done on the outside, setting up scoreboard impacts, helping his teammates. It's these powers combined that has fantasy coaches going, yes, he can be a fantasy premium.
Yeah, I mean, you're looking for the players that have those patches in seasons where they go, right, this is me. This is who I am as a fantasy scorer. I want to be, 100, 105 averaging over that block. And you look for them and you think back and you think, right, well, if I'm wanting to start a player, what do I need to see in their scoring history to justify that? And I think a 6-week block, where, as you said, he averaged nearly 100 in AFL fantasy and, 102 in SuperCoach, shows enough of that ceiling and that consistency from a player who's coming only into their 4th year as well. Like,
yeah,
we always talk about the 3rd-year breakout, but there's some stats for 4th-year breakouts as well. And I think Serong can definitely continue to improve and push that 100 marker in both of those formats, or all of the formats at least, and have a consistent year where he goes, not at 87 or 90 in SuperCoach, but goes at, 95 to 100 in AFL fantasy and over 100, 105 in SuperCoach, because he's shown he can do it for a 6-week block. And all it takes is, removing those bad games where you go sub 70 in AFL fantasy and sub 80 in SuperCoach, and a couple of games where you pop a little bit more of a ceiling, and all of a sudden you're at that mark. And he's shown that he has the skill to be able to do that. He's shown that he has a consistency to be able to do that in a block of games. All that has to happen now is he just needs to put the 2 together and do that over an entire season.
Yeah, and we even saw moments in the AFL finals he did it. Again, it's very different football, but it certainly suited him, that hot contested footy. 120 in fantasy and Dream Team and 118 in SuperCoach in those 2 games. And you bang on, MiniMonk, with these young players. It's all about trajectory and trend. Can we go from moments to quarters to games to a series of games to show your fantasy pedigree? And I think the answer for Serong is yes, he's doing all those things. The question is now, can you do it for not just 6 or 3 or 4 or 8 weeks? Can you do it for 10, 12, or in season 23, can you do it for 23 weeks? It's an interesting year when you look at what he did, and then you look at what's coming in to that Fremantle side. It was that injury interrupted season with the knee. Of the 7 sub 80 scores he had last year, 4 of them across the formats were in the first 5 weeks. So his stat line immediately improves when you look at him post injuries. His stat line really jumps. But what fascinates me, MiniMonk, and you're the Freo fan of the coaches panel, so I'm keen on your take here, is there's a significant out and arguably an equally significant in that has come in to this Dockers side. Mundy out, O'Meara in. What does that mean for Serong, both in his role and even to an extent what happens through centre bounces more broadly speaking?
Yeah, I don't see his role changing too much. I think Freo have tried to go very like for like with the replacement of Mundy with Jaeger O'Meara. Mundy has been a staple of Fremantle's midfield rotation for the last 10 years, and his presence for Brayshaw and Serong during their youth and their development cannot be, overstated. He was phenomenal in providing that big body, that calm head, and that composure that allowed them to develop to be the players that they are now. And I think they've brought in Jaeger to try and bridge that gap a little bit and potentially try and provide some support for the younger players. But I don't think that O'Meara will get the same CBA share that Mundy does. He will still get a fairly significant share. Freo will run a very, very tight CBA rotation, which will mainly be Brayshaw, Serong, Jaeger O'Meara, and Brodie. And outside of that, there may be a few players that get 5 or 10% here and there, such as Fife, maybe an Erasmus, maybe a Johnson. Maybe if they're trying to throw some explosivity in there, they might chuck a Walters in. But I think that the share that Serong will get because of Mundy's departure and O'Meara's, coming into the club will increase. We're talking, 70% to maybe 75, 80%. But even that might be enough. I mean, there were statistics from him from last season where when he had more than 70% CBAs in a game, he averaged 10 points per game more in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team and 8 points per game more in SuperCoach. And so even a small bump like that can have a significant impact on a player who's, just on that edge of being someone that you can consider.
It's a really great stats pick up. And one of the things I think of why people have overlooked Serong this year is there's a lot of guys at this price point across the formats. Some of them have already been revealed so far in the 50 most relevant. Others may not appear, but names like Chad Warner, Luke Davies-Uniacke, Tom Green, Jai Newcomb, and Adam Chera, his former teammate. These are just 5 young guns in the competition that across formats are $5, $10, $15, $20,000, some of them, difference in point. And then you've got a fallen guy like a Whitfield who's got the history of a 110. So because he's had a quote unquote down season, in contrast to probably some of these other guys who have got maybe a more positive narrative around him, the challenge is, can you choose Serong over these guys versus if I do choose Serong over these guys, I might be creating some positive separation.
Yeah, and I think the narrative for Serong, as with a lot of these guys, is that they're all relatively young in their seasons, and they're all relatively young in the AFL. The only one in that list who's had more than 6 seasons in the AFL or more than 5 seasons in the AFL is Whitfield.
Yeah.
But I don't see his name talked about as much as the others. I mean, Warner, Chera, Newcomb, LDU, Green, these are all players that are 5 years or younger in the AFL. They're all continuing to progress upwards. They're all the young contested type bull players in their midfields. And they all have the potential to become out and out premiums for their sides and for us in AFL Fantasy, SuperCoach and Dream Team. And normally this price point where you're priced at around about that 90 average is considered just around that awkward price point. It's just that price where you're thinking, oh, if I spend 50, 60K more, I can get an out and out premium that'll last me for the end of the year. Or, there's not enough value in here. I'm going to drop it down to somewhere in 100K less and try and find some value and use that, trim the fat somewhere. But when you've got such a clustering of these guys that are within, as you say, 10, 20, 30K of each other, chances are most teams are going to try and start one, maybe 2 of them. And it's about trying to find which one you want to start. And the other thing is, if there's all of these options at that price point, if one of them fails, it's not hard to just move to the other one. It's a very easy move. And so then you got to be thinking, right, which of them do I want to start? And you got to look at it and say, right, why do I want to start them? Is there a narrative around them? Well, for players like Green and LDU, there's a narrative around there's going to be opportunities. For players like Warner, he's continued to improve as a player. For someone like Chera, maybe there's, a bit of absence of Walsh, which will increase his scoring. Newcomb, he's basically one of the most experienced midfielders left in Hawthorn. And people have kind of not looked at a narrative for Serong. They've kind of just gone, right, don't really want to start him. He's burnt me before. But I think the narrative for him is maybe Freo have a really, really easy run to start the year.
It's
like the first 6 weeks.
North Melbourne, West Coast, Adelaide, Gold Coast, and the Western Bulldogs are the first 6 weeks. It really will tighten up against the Lions in round 7, but those are all midfielders that the Dockers shouldn't just come comparable to, but their fantasy opportunities are there.
Yeah, exactly. And if he fails, heaven forbid, you just jump off.
those first 2 to 4 trades are always correctional, aren't they? Whether they be rookies, premiums, stepping stones, you always have to factor in, even in the limited trades formats, heading into round 3 before the bubble. What are the 2 to 3 trades you're going to make that are correctional? Because I know I want to get your take on his SuperCoach scoring in a second, because I think there's a narrative that he's only a dream team and fantasy guy, and I think there's some flaw in that. But what's your take on this? Is a trade valued at the same point whether you're trading a cow or trading a premium, or is there a difference in that?
I think that the purpose for cows is for you to generate cash.
Sure.
And so you need them to score enough to generate cash. And sometimes that's going to come over a 4 or 5 week stint. Sometimes that's going to come over a 10 to 15 week stint. And the point of your premiums is to score points.
Yeah.
You need them to be banging out 100s, 105s to prove that they've got the kind of scoring to justify being in your team. And so that you have to weigh them differently. If a premium isn't performing with his scores, that's when you have to move him out. But if a cow isn't performing with their scoring, the same narrative doesn't hold, because it might be like, well, they haven't generated enough cash, I have to hold on to them. And so, I think that you need to be more willing to say, right, this premium isn't performing. He isn't the one that I need. Like there was a bunch of defender premiums last year that had that, like not Jaden Short, sorry, Lockie Whitfield in SuperCoach. Didn't start the year well. A lot of people got very stubborn. They said, no, I want to hold this guy. He's going to be a consistent performer. And he just continued to let you down week on and never landed. But to flick a premium like that early on in the season and say, right, they don't have the role, I think it's fine. I think you've got to be, willing to make those moves. And I think it's become more justifiable with the increase in trades that have happened in Dream Team and SuperCoach over the years.
100%. You've got trade boosts now, so you can really maximize how you use that. So I'm with you. Before we wrap up our take on Serong, I see a lot of people in AFL fantasy, once they've heard this podcast, going, oh, I could run a midfield that's just got 1, maybe max of 2 kind of captaincy options in my midfield. And now I can run 3 of LDU, Green, Warner, Serong, Newcomb. Like, I can get this nice bunch that could all pop up to 100. And that might be the right approach. It might not be, but I think people can see why in AFL fantasy you can jump off easier. There'll still be that legacy coach that struggles with that idea that you've mentioned of, oh, he's not delivering well, so I'll trade out a guy I hope to hold for the year. But there is this place in SuperCoach. I'm keen on your take. There's some stats you've got for us, because I shared how good he is at stoppages and clearances, but is there anything that shows he's on a pathway that he could match it with some legacy premiums?
Yeah, I think that when you think about Serong, you think of him as a very contested player. He gets a lot of inside ball, but the problem in his SuperCoach for him is that he gets let down by his disposal efficiency.
Yes.
He has a lot of clangers. He isn't very accurate with the way that he kicks and handballs the ball. Bit of a butcher at times. But that's something that can be cleaned up, and that's something that improves with players over time. And there's a narrative that could be a way for him to increase his scoring over time.
Sure.
But I think a really interesting one is to compare his contested possession rate to other contested balls that have been in the past in SuperCoach. Okay. And for me, the ones that stand out when you're talking about contested players that just rack it up in and under, game in, game out, Ben Cunnington.
No doubt. Yep.
And Josh Kennedy.
Yeah, from the Swans.
JPK, not JKJ.
Yeah.
And Serong has gone from 7.5 to 9.5 to 11.5 contested possessions a game.
Nice.
That's 40% of his possessions in a game are contested. And you compare that to someone like Cunnington and Josh Kennedy after their 3rd year. Kennedy is an absolute freak. 14.5 contested possessions a game. That's a lot. Cunnington, 8.5 a game.
Dang.
Serong is smack bang in the middle of these 2 players. He's going to be the same type of player for the next 5 years, where he's just that hard body. He's going to be extractive for Fremantle, getting the ball from the inside to the outside. And I can only see that number increasing as responsibilities continue to go onto him.
I agree.
And so you pair those 2 things together. You pair an increase in contested possessions and a decrease in his and an increase in his disposal efficiency. That's just oof. There's some significant increase that's going to come in his scoring in SuperCoach. Might not be next year, might
Yeah.
take a few more years, but it could be next year, and it could be very, very juicy for the owners that are willing to start him.
Yeah, I really, really like that. He's a fascinating player. There's a lot in and around him that others might like over him. But again, it's another reason why Serong might just be really right for your fantasy side. Draft day is an interesting one, MiniMonk, because he's not getting the love that some of those others are getting, even though he's ranked pretty much 45th mid across the formats once you remove the DPPs. That puts him in an M5 spot. I don't know if he goes that late. I feel like that feels a bit of a steal across the formats. There's M3 upside, but there's M5 basement. Where do you think he goes?
It's probably somewhere in between those two.
Yeah.
It's probably an M4. You're probably pretty comfortable taking an M4 range. I think if you got him in an M5, you've got a steal on draft day. There's a little bit of value built into him, as you said, when he came into the season with a bit of a knee niggle and his scoring wasn't quite there. There might be a coach that takes a punt him at an M3, and I wouldn't begrudge that, but I think it might be slightly early. You might be trying to, put too many eggs into the same basket and say, no, I think Serong can be a 100 guy. I think that's maybe a little premature, but I think you're very comfortable taking it M4. And I think that he provides you with a lot of consistent scoring at that draft point as well.
I think so. Look, if you really want to have him in, you have to leap at a D3, at an M3. Sorry, like if you want him, you've just got to go early, because if you hope he'll get to your M4, there's a chance. But if you're then even try to run the gauntlet even deeper and go, maybe I'll get him at M5s where he's 20-22 average, you'll have him. Well, you're playing with fire at that point.
Yeah, you really are.
Through there. So it'll be interesting to see what he does in 2023 and where he goes as his ADP for the season. MiniMonk, an absolute pleasure to have you back on these podcasts, mate.
Thanks for having me. And it's a good one to be able to talk about the team I support and the players that I love to watch week in, week out. And can't wait for more of them.
Yeah, we will talk about more Dockers, I can guarantee, in the 50 most relevant. If you want to go and read the article on Caleb Serong, it is online for you now at coachespanel.tv, along with all the other players we've revealed so far in the 50 most relevant. I'll give you a clue in just a moment about who I've got at number 33. But if you're loving these podcasts, there's a couple of things you can do. Make sure you follow them wherever you're streaming or downloading this podcast from. Make sure you follow there. Leave a nice 5-star rating and review. It takes just a couple of seconds to do it, but certainly helps us out. Or you could become a Patreon supporter for just a couple of bucks a month. It helps us financially do everything we do here at the Coaches Panel, but also we'll kick in some extra bonus stuff for your financial support. Hidden access to groups, exclusive content that we don't share with anybody else but with our Patreons, extra podcasts during the season come your way. And if you become a premium or a breakout tier supporter, you get these podcasts 24 hours early. So if you want it, coachespanel.tv is where you can become a Patreon. Number 33 in the 50 most relevant. They're not a docker, so maybe MiniMonk won't be on their podcast. All right, here's what I'll say. There were 6 players that we contrasted Caleb Serong scoring and price point against. The 6 players were Chad Warner, Luke Davies-Uniacke, Jai Newcomb, Tom Green, Adam Chera, and Lockie Whitfield. Tomorrow, we're talking about one of those guys. And if you go back and look at the history of the 50 most relevant this year, it'll narrow the field even more for you. Who's tomorrow in the 50 most relevant?